Kia ora, kia ora. Welcome back, everybody, to What a Load of Kaloni, our podcast series that looks at political issues of interest to us, ngā mokopuna Māori, o tēnei whenua, o Aotearoa, Deutsch. We are going to be having a look specifically over the next few episodes at the issue of conspiracy theories and why are we going to be focusing on conspiracy theories? Well, few reasons. One, we're coming up to an election and, misinformation and disinformation has played a huge role in a few national elections around the world now. USA is one, UK is another, Brazil is another. Three interesting elections, all of whom had misinformation and disinformation feature prominently through the election, all of which I'm going to say didn't work out so well for Indigenous peoples or for reasonable peoples or for people who aren't eggs. So, I think, just in terms of our political landscape at the moment, it's an important issue for us to be discussing. It's important for us to be discussing as a public health issue. And I say that because, I was one of our local whānau who was really concerned about the impact that COVID was going to have on our community. And we were a really proactive community in relation to COVID. And I'm of a mind actually that our success in staying COVID free as a community here in Matakawa came down to our kotahitanga and our very, very low figures as a region in Te Tairāwhiti was due to our kotahitanga, our ability to be able to move collectively as a group and develop our strategies and roll with those strategies all came down to kotahitanga, really, I think. And so conspiracy theories really do have potential to carve communities up and sow division and impact on our kotahitanga. So I see that as a direct threat to our public health. And what else? And there are other implications as well. I have a really strong interest in racism and understanding the way that racism works in Aotearoa, and for those who are involved in combating racism, misinformation and disinformation campaigns comes up very often. They played a strong role in the Christchurch mosque attacks. They often play a strong role when they are utilised against Māori. I mean, the foreshore and seabed, we have misinformation campaigns that turn into legislation. Anyway, I was going to just go down a whole nother avenue of the way in which misinformation and disinformation has actually powered a whole raft of legislation, anti-Māori legislation, but we'll get to that. We will get to that. So in this podcast series, we're going to be covering kind of like the whakapapa of misinformation and disinformation. That's what today's podcast episode is going to be talking about. We're also going to be looking at, for for instance, today's one is who are the architects of the modern misinformation and disinformation movement, and what are their characteristics? What characteristics do they share? We're also going to be talking about the culture of misinformation and disinformation and how that has developed over time. We will be talking about how that's crossed over into Aotearoa, the information scape, the global information landscape. And we're also going to be talking about how do we talk to our whānau about these things? How do we talk to each other about these things? When do we talk to each other about these things? What are some good tools? Where do you draw the line and just say, no more. See you at Christmas. We'll talk about this over some kina. Everything's better over kina. And when do you just say, okay, well, come on, let's have a cup of tea and a private talk about this now? What are those good times to talk about it? And also, what are some of the tools for us to make sense of information when it's placed in front of us? What are our reflections around mātauranga Māori? I'm going to be interviewing a few cool people along the way and having some reflections and chats as well. So anyway, let's get talking about the whakapapa, if you will, of conspiracy theories. So for me, I started to learn about conspiracy theories. Actually, let's even just talk about the word conspiracy theories, because there's better terms I think we can develop around this. You're probably going to hear me say the word often because we've started to associate them. But here's the weakness when we talk about the term conspiracy theories. The weakness is that we risk suggesting that conspiracies are not valid and real. All conspiracies are not valid and real. That's the risk when we just use this catchphrase, conspiracy theories. And I know that there are some people who suggest that the very term conspiracy theory was developed by the CIA, I think, to throw people off the scent of JFK's actual assassin. There is actually apparently some evidence to suggest that the CIA did at some point plant hyper-conspiracy theories with a view to undermining the conspiracy theorist movement, to try and minimize insurgency against the US government. That they've done that, but they did not invent the term conspiracy theory. You know, if you look up the etymology, like the whakapapa of the word, it's existed for quite some time. And as a concept, the idea of planting and seeding distrust with the communities of your enemies it's got a long history. So certainly it's not a concept that was invented by the CIA to throw the scent off at something that was actually happening. I think maybe rabbit hole logic might be another better term, because it's talking about the logic. I'm specifically talking about these theories that are like interconnected with all these other theories, and you wind up going down this hole of distrust and paranoia, and it's very difficult to find your way out. A lot of them are circular and they feed into each other, very much like the rabbit hole that goes down into Wonderland. You don't know which way is up or down. So if we talk about it as rabbit hole logic, I guess that kind of has a bit of a closer connotation than conspiracy theories in and of itself, because there are some genuine conspiracies. The doctrine of discovery is a genuine conspiracy. The way in which oil and gas and big plastics have colluded with governments to deregulate their environmental protections. Like there's real conspiracies. And I guess that's one of the tragedies of the misinformation campaigns that are going on right now, is that they suck energy away from things that we genuinely do need to be engaging with. And then the other part of it is that, it can have whānau become so dissuaded, so put off around that type of information that they don't engage with these really, because they think, oh, are you a conspiracy? Are you a conspiracy? Are you a conspiracy theorist? Everybody's a conspiracy theorist. And so they don't engage with these issues that we have been fighting for a long time to get people to engage with and in. So it muddies the landscape about the things that we should and shouldn't be engaging in. And for those of us who have been engaged in trying to call, industry to account and trying to call governments to account, it's not helpful. It's not helpful to have the ones in the middle. So, just a little bit around the whole definition of conspiracy theories. When you do hear me using it, I'm just going to be upfront and say it's because I'm being lazy. I should probably be using the term rabbit hole logic, and I'm going to try, but I can't make any promises. But in general, when I'm talking about conspiracy theories in these podcasts, I'm going to be talking about the rabbit hole logic ones that are a distraction. And then we're going to have a whole episode of talking about what are the real conspiracy theories for us to be focusing on. Okay. So getting into this first series around some of the architects. We've already spent 12 minutes just describing what we're going to be talking about. So I'm going to try and keep these nice and succinct for us, because I know nobody wants to sit around for a long time listening to somebody else talk. So if we look back at, where these ideas came from around coming up with misinformation and disinformation, we have to first of all accept that there are people out there who will develop deliberately misleading content and seed that into communities with a specific intent. And then there are the communities who pick it up and roll with it. Might not have the same intent, but they'll pick it up and roll with it. And it is carrying out its original intent by the people who developed it. So some of those ideas came along very, very early on in the piece. And Sun Tzu, for those who might be familiar with the Art of War, which is a famous military strategist text. Sun Tzu was himself a famous military strategist from China. I think it's like 500 BC. When was he around? Yeah, from 544 BC, and then passed away 496 BC. There you go. And he wrote this book called The Art of War, and over time, it's been referred back to multiple times, and as a military strategic text, it's been picked up and used in war in Vietnam and, around the world, really, but also by corporates as well. People look at it within corporate warfare as having valid strategies. And it's been noted that it is a favorite text for people that term themselves cyber warriors. Cyber warriors are people who like to engage in online strategies to sow and seed distrust or try to establish forms of control through the internet. And so Sun Tzu and his Art of War text speaks to the ways in which information can be utilized to establish social control. And that he talks about the acme of skill. So he says that where the enemy can be subdued without killing by attacking his ability to be able to execute a coherent strategy, that is his acme of skill. It's a way in which you can build your empire without having to engage in direct battle, by undermining their community's trust and their ability to be able to work together and come together. You can create these, what they call these bloodless victories. And so this whole idea of using information, using concealment, using confusion, using deception, using dissimulation, and assuming this level of authority and making suggestions as if they're true, but they're not. That is detailed in the Art of War from the 5th century BC as not just a valid but a very effective tactic of establishing social control. And as I said, it's been picked up by military forces, picked up by corporate entities, and picked up by cyber communities who wish themselves to be establishing a level of control. So it's not anything new. It's been around for a long time. Some of the people who spoke about this, and also the propaganda machine. Look at the way in which Joseph Goebbels operated in the Second World War, the heavy focus on misinformation and propaganda through the Second World War is well documented. Hitler himself, came out with some out the gate suggestion, just blatant mistruths, clear and blatant mistruths. And if anybody has ever read Mein Kampf is the document that Hitler wrote while he was in prison. And, it's an interesting text to read. I read it when I was in high school. Don't judge me. I read it when I was in high school because I was interested in how how could somebody who could carry out such atrocities, where does that mindset come from? And I think it's interesting to remember and to note that at the time when Hitler's theories really took seed in the German consciousness, they had come out of World War I. Things weren't looking great socially. Their belief in themselves was down. They needed somebody to blame. And you're going to see this theme come up as we discuss misinformation. People needed someone to blame. And Hitler just came along at the right time and said, blame the Jews. And they did, with disastrous consequences. And so, but he was very effective, very audacious, and very bold in his mistruths, and very effective. And so when you read Mein Kampf, the interesting thing when you read it is that it's a whole lot of half pages. There's so much of that book where half the page is what he actually wrote in his journals. And the other half a page is dedicated to the footnotes telling you the actual truth. Huge lies around how well he did in school and, how intelligent he was, his marks, and, his career and his successes. And then the actual truth underneath that is often the polar opposite. The historical documents, his actual reasons why he left, the actual reasons why he was in jail, all of those things are clearly documented as being the pretty much opposite of what he said, but he just boldly and audaciously write it down and make these suggestions anyway. So fellow was drinking his own Kool-Aid. I think he believed his own titos, and in that, I think, that's a part of what makes them so convincing, is that they do believe they're so convincing, they believe their own lies. Anyway, another person, actually, that the next architect I'm going to speak a little bit about, his name is Bill Cooper. Not too, it has a few similarities also to I'm not going to call him our man, to Adolf Hitler as well. Also was very fond of bold, audacious lies. And when you put the footnotes of his life up next to his suggestions, very similar practice of presenting something as if it's, really confidently, as if it's the truth. And it turns out it's not. So an example of that would be, Bill Cooper was, if I describe him, he's called the grandfather. He's considered to be the grandfather of the modern conspiracy movement. And he came out of the Second World War. He was raised during the Cold War, where there was just this ever-present tension between US and Russia, and was in this whole space of, being raised a military brat, on the military bases, never quite sure if any moment the ever-present threat of nuclear war was going to come crashing down on their head, always raised around guns and bombs. And so, he lived a little bit of a paranoid childhood, I guess is what I want to say. And he also had a job as a secretary of an admiral in the Navy. And he took that little bit of military experience and blew it out of proportion and made out that he had had access to all of this top secret information that he saw in his admiral's cabinet. He often talks about that in his own, I guess it was the early form of podcasts, but in his own broadcasts, he talks about the admiral's cabinet and all of the things that he saw in there. So, but, it turns out he often also inflated his role within the military. As it turns out, he was just a secretary for an admiral in the Navy. But also he would make up things and say, like the government were out to assassinate him. He had an accident one day, and he tells this story repeatedly about how, and in his book as well, Behold a Pale Horse, and which is kind of a cult classic in the United States, by the way, but is also the birthing point of a lot of conspiracy theories. So he talks about how the United States were out to kill him, and he was once nearly driven off the road, and he was and this US agent came up and had a gun at him and was going to kill him or some stuff like that, and he only just escaped with his life. I think he claims that he faked being dead, and he was severely injured and this. Anyway, as it turns out, his father and all of his family said, no, 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 no. Those injuries that he got and that day that he claims that happened, he came off his bike. People who were there were able to testify that Boiso fell off his bike, rode into something, I understand. And that was how he got the injuries. Not just that, but like there are, you could write a book on the stuff that has been disproven. But he's very audacious, really bold in the way that he puts these things across, and so people believed him. He was one of the first ones also, first fellows also to develop this theory of a global cabal of, I think he said it was 15, the MJ15, who were like nothing to do with Michael Jackson. He doesn't come into this yet, although don't worry, we could probably find a space for him in this whole story. Any conspiracy theorists who are listening, rabbit hole folk who are listening, who want to clue me in on how Michael Jackson fits into all of this, have at it. Give us a call, comment below, whatever you do. Anyway, the MJ15, who are not the Jackson 5 times 3, they're like this global cabal of hyper uber wealthy people who actually control the world, and the American president, US president, is briefed on them before he comes into power. But they've also controlled apparently every single president since Ronald Reagan, but they don't control Donald Trump. Donald Trump is the one that was going to come save us from them. But, as it was at the time, so that's the theory that's been, once it's been picked up by QAnon folk, is that Donald Trump is going to save us from him. But as it was at the time, Bill Cooper developed this theory of the MJ15 that has controlled every president since Ronald Reagan up to the current ones that he was faced with before his untimely death. Now, he did die, and it would be easy, I think, for people to go, oh, see, he died the way that he said he was going to die, therefore everything he said was true. Now, the fella died because he didn't pay his taxes, drank a bit much of his own Kool-Aid, became hyper paranoid about everything going on in the world, made his own little compound on top of a mountain that he didn't own, but decided to start threatening everybody with guns who came up the mountain because he believed that they were coming up to get him. So even people who were just going for a mountain trek came across a man wielding a gun, shaking it at them and yelling at them and threatening them. So the previous sheriff who was operating in his area was kind of having this bit of a hands-off, leave him alone, just warn people not to go up that way approach. New sheriff came in, said, I don't think so, we're not going to roll with that. Went up there to confront him. He pulled a gun on the sheriff, shot the sheriff's aide in the head and killed him, and got shot back for his troubles and died. So I'm going to go out on a limb and say, if you shoot a police officer in the head, you're probably going to get shot. For a lot of Pākehā in the United States, that's kind of what you have to do to get shot. Is literally shoot another policeman in the head in front of his mate. Anyway, I'm not going to go down that pathway either, but that's Bill Cooper for you, granddaddy of the modern conspiracy theory movement, granddaddy of the theory that there's a global cabal who are actually controlling everything. And I want to say at this point, we do have a podcast episode later on to discuss the real conspiracy theories. And, I don't want to come across as saying that there isn't such a thing as power imbalance and corruption. There absolutely is a thing such as power imbalance and corruption. There absolutely are people who control a huge amount of the world's wealth as well. And they do have unscrupulous, I guess I would say, relationships with governments. That does happen. I don't believe that there's one small group of people who come together in a secret gathering to move everything around on their little chessboard and keep it a secret from everybody. It's more like there's a system of European supremacy, which we can easily trace back through the spread of imperialism, that lends itself towards a particular group being hyper wealthy and holding power relationships that exclude communities of colour, marginalised groups, any groups that don't look like them and behave like them and believe like them. Anyways, as I said, there'll be another episode for those discussions, but certainly the whole idea of a small group that gets together and plays chess with the world, that came from Bill Cooper's reckonings, who I don't want to say was an evil guy. He's definitely a very complex guy, and definitely a compulsive liar. That much has been proven. And a lot of his theories, I don't know whether or not he intended to sow distrust in the way that Sun Tzu described, these information tactics. Certainly he believed that, the USA was not well, and he intended to encourage distrust in the US government. So would I, if we were being honest, so would I. But that was, definitely the intention of what it was that he was putting out there, which was to, I don't know whether or not he wanted to open up a war, but he certainly wanted to see distrust in the US government. And people wanted someone to blame again at that time. The US myth of 2.5 children in a house and economic well-being and security and everything, which is all really a bit of a colonial lie anyway, a colonial myth of well-being that's built off the dispossession of Indigenous peoples. But that is what Bill Cooper felt that he was entitled to. That is what Bill Cooper felt that he was being denied by the US government. And that is why he was calling upon people to sow distrust, so that, and this is a common theme that we hear often in the MAGA camp, so that they could go back to the good old days, which never really existed in his life anyway, because as I said, he grew up as a military brat surrounded by paranoia, but he believed that he was due and that America was due, USA was due, this mythic reality of 2.5 kids in Pleasantville, and that this is something that was being denied to them by the government, and so the government had to be overthrown. Now, this found naturally very fertile soil in the extreme right-wing movement, who also believed that the good old days were characterized by men going to work, women staying at home, we're all right if we're all white, and none of this politically correct nonsense that comes in to upset our nice Pleasantville realities. And so the white conspiracist neo-Nazi movements who sought a return back to these colonially misogynist dominant spaces were very supportive of what Bill Cooper was suggesting. He also was really big on pushing the UFO conspiracies, the Roswell. If you remember, like me, the 80s and the 90s, there were a whole lot of conspiracy theories out there around Roswell, Area 51 or 54. Can't remember what it was. A lot of what Bill Cooper detailed was picked up by popular media, and it was one of the root influences of the X-Files and the show Roswell. And so, again, just, these were the kinds of theories that Bill Cooper was into and seeding out there. As I say, he died an untimely death. I guess if you can call it untimely, seeing as he defined it himself. It became a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. He did predict it, but I think anybody could have predicted it when you took his pathway and his suggestions to the logical extension, which was, he was saying, don't trust in any systems of authority. Everybody's out to get you, sowing paranoia and mistrust. He became paranoid and mistrustful. He also came a cropper with local authorities. He just eventually wound up carrying that to its logical conclusion. Didn't work out so well for him. So, and then you have the likes of Alex Jones. So Alex Jones was around and broadcasting at the same time as Bill Cooper. He kind of idolized Bill Cooper. I understand Bill Cooper felt less inclined towards, Alex Jones. Alex Jones, many of you might have seen him. He has a program called InfoWars. He's a far-right extremist, conservative politician, Trump supporter, and also, supported and promoted a lot of these conspiracy theories as well. He developed Pizzagate, the conspiracy theory that has just recently come up in the New Zealand News. New Zealand Herald published an article talking about how the pizza emojis represent pedophilia and child trafficking. Child trafficking is another conspiracy theory that it's quite an upsetting one, because child trafficking, obviously, it's real, it does happen, and it's something that we need to definitely be paying attention to and combating. But the rabbit hole movement have co-opted the child trafficking issue and twisted it into their own means. So if we look at Alex Jones and Pizzagate, we need to also understand and look at folks like Steve Bannon, who is kind of in the early stages of Trump's campaign. He was a very contentious figure who was the lead campaign advisor for Trump, developed the misinformation campaign around Hillary Clinton, being a part of this global cabal of pedophile, Satan-worshipping global leaders and politicians who also sell children. And he did that deliberately to undermine Hillary Clinton's campaign when she was running against Trump in the last US elections. And so And, I'm not at all defending Hillary Clinton either. She's a warmonger. Democracy was not, the Democratic government, even under Obama, had been engaged in, resource-based wars and oil and gas. Well, I would call them climate crimes, continuing oil and gas extraction when we can least afford it. The wealth and poverty gaps continue to grow between them. Economic injustice continued to grow. Underneath the Democratic Party as well. The working class felt very disenfranchised under the Democratic Party, and people wanted someone to blame. And again, Donald Trump just came in at the right time, and they created a group that you could blame that drew from this long history of suggesting that there's this abstract group of Satan-worshipping pedophiles controlling everything, and that they're all elitists and they're not actually here to listen to you. But you know me, because I've been in your lounge rooms and the TV screens. This is Trump's suggestion, that you know me. I'm like you. I've been in your lounge rooms every week with my reality shows. You can trust me. I'll be here to look after the little guys. And it worked. Again, it worked. And people believed him. Very similar to the rhetoric used by Boris Johnson in the UK elections. Very similar to the rhetoric used by Jair Bolsonaro in the Brazil elections as well. Just really highlighting on the way in which imperialist governments in general have not served the working class. They never have, nor have they served, of course, communities of colour or Indigenous communities. Never have. And then position themselves as the saviours. And so Steve Bannon really championed Trump as the saviour who will be the one president that's not controlled by this global cabal. Never mind that this is a guy who has actually been and has been investigated for child sexual assault, child rape and rape of women, and has been, recorded and played being deeply misogynist, is a multi-billionaire himself and his economic activities and injustice has been detailed as well. You can track all of that easily on media. All of that will be erased by the misinformation campaign that positions him as the saviour of the working class and the underprivileged. It's quite a piece of work. And so, if you look at Joe Biden, the Pizzagate conspiracy largely went along the lines of Joe Biden is a part of this global cabal through his association with Hillary Clinton and Obama as well. And because he eats pizza, and there's a pizza shop in the USA that this pizza shop is where this global cabal, this Satan worshipping pedophile global uber wealthy group would meet at a pizza shop in Washington because Joe Biden ate pizza. That's the strength of the connections these groups make. That pizza shop, the real world implications for that is that pizza shop had somebody walk into it and start firing an automatic rifle. And that pizza shop was set on fire. Had nothing to do with any of those, the poor people who owned that pizza shop. They did nothing. and they wound up coming under fire from all of this. So that's Pizzagate, and that was started by this fellow Alex Jones. He's a real piece of work. You look at his Wikipedia and the stuff that he came up with. But again, another far right person who also promoted this idea of white genocide, that there's this other part of this global cabal is that they want to carry out white genocide and also carry out genocide of the working classes, and there's another form of it that they want to kill off 70% of the world's population and just leave the top wealthy 30% of the world's population. That was picked up here in Aotearoa by the New Zealand National Front, as I said, our own little neo-Nazi group, headed for quite a few years by a fellow called Cole Chapman. We'll get into that in a subsequent episode as well. But it's the fear that there's this white genocide, in the plans, is one of the theories that was picked up by the New Zealand National Front. It's one of the theories that also featured prominently in the manifesto of the bottom-feeding piece of trash that carried out the Christchurch mosque attacks as well. So, it's if you go back and have a look at these, at the way in which these architects have grown the modern conspiracy movement, it's quite interesting. QAnon is the next part of the puzzle, I think, for us to consider. QAnon, you'll see, you might see on your website WWG1WGA hashtag. It's a hashtag. It means where we go one, we go all. And it's a common hashtag from a rabbit hole group called QAnon, which came again out of the 4chan and 8chan message boards, which is where, the Christchurch attacks, that the manifesto for that was posted up on those message boards. That's where a lot of these white supremacist folks hang out. It's a source of a lot of hyper racist and misogynist material, and there were a number of anon groups. There was FBI anon. There were all of these different people who would post up on these sites with this idea of this fantasy of these spy fantasies that they are, like what Bill Cooper said, they have this top secret information that nobody else has, and they would leak it onto the site. And there was one who was called Q, and he would leak his information onto the site. And, there were about 3 people from that site who had prominent YouTube accounts and prominent followings themselves, who decided that they would take Q's reckonings and boost the following around them, seeding them into other communities, featuring them on their YouTube channels, and creating a following around this person Q's suggestions, which again centered around this global cabal of Satan worshipping pedophiles, but also centered around the idea that the United Nations was essentially a home, a nest for these Satan worshipping pedophile world controllers, and that the SDG goals were the Sustainable Development Goals were actually about global control, domination, and also carbon measures, carbon taxes were another form of economic global control. And that climate change isn't really real. Again, a form of global control by this elite group. And so these things naturally, again, found seed in white supremacist groups. They were promoted really strongly by white supremacist groups. They took seed in the 4chan and 8chan, which are white supremacist message boards. But they were then promoted out into the world. And, the thing is with these groups, they don't mind when it's non-white communities picking these things up. One, it's seeding division within those communities, and that works for them, because following the logic of Sun Tzu, these are the kinds of things that you want to do. And if you remember what I said at the beginning of this podcast, those are the kinds of things, seeding division in your groups. That's what you want to do. That's how you create a bloodless coup, is to sow division in those people's ranks. But two, these other people will take the front line for you, place their bodies on the line. And then three, when this happens, when there is, they want discord just as much as everybody else. They just want it for their own reasons. They want it because they want to reinstate another utopic space for them, which looks like white supremacy, the return of the patriarchy, the undoing of all of the progress around, Indigenous rights and civil rights. And, that's what they want to undo. They don't mind how they get there. They just want that to happen. And if brown people get to place their bodies on the line in order to get there, then all the better, because we can remain safe. And they know that it'll be easier for them to reestablish the status quo than for us to move into a space of actual justice that we haven't seen since imperialism took over the planet. So those are some of the conspiracy theories that were set and trained by Q and his Anons, the army of the Anons. And then, of course, it takes seed here in Aotearoa, where you have these other people. Now, Q also suggested that he had military experience, military connections that provided this top secret information that nobody else knew. And there's a common thread right across them around people who believe that they had this. It's a kind of a narcissistic suggestion that they have this special access to information. And we're seeing that play out again today as well with some of our more locally centered rabbit hole theorists who suggest that they have military intelligence, are probably hyperinflating that claim, or have been proven to be hyperinflating that claim, or people who just suggest that they have a leak, a special leak. More often than not, it's not that special at all. It's information that's readily available, or it's just complete toots, stuff that they've made up themselves. So yeah, those are just some really common characteristics that are interesting to note across time of these people who believe that they have these special information channels that none of us have. So there we have it. That's kind of my overview of the architects that lead us up to today, where we're at today. Going back to Sun Tzu and the art of war, and the suggestion that you could easily build an empire without spilling blood if you can sow discord and distrust amongst their ranks. The use of propaganda by Goebbels and Hitler the audacious use of mistruth by Hitler and Bill Cooper. The suggestion by Bill Cooper that he has this military intelligence, source of military intelligence, and the birth of these ideas of a global cabal that's out there to control the world through the manipulation of power. That translation over into Alex Jones and Pizzagate and Steve Bannon and his support for Trump, who also suggests, all of them, including Trump, suggest that there is a global cabal. Another interesting thing about both Trump and Steve Bannon is both of them openly admit that there is a valid strategy of completely overturning the current incumbent power systems in order to undo all of the progress that civil society have made. By civil society, I mean, rights interest groups, Indigenous rights, coloured communities or communities of colour, LGBTQI communities, people who have really fought for ideas and ideals of social justice to come to the forefront. Both of them have said that a valid tactic in undoing the progress of those groups to return us back to a space of white supremacy and patriarchal control is to completely overturn the system and cause social discord. So, and QAnon, another group that champion Trump as the savior of the working class, again deeply rooted into white supremacist centers and spaces as well. So yeah, that's our first podcast series. Hope that was informative for you all. The next series that we're going to be looking at is looking at the culture of distrust. So looking at how global information systems kind of assault us with knowledge, the way in which incel culture and gaming culture has influenced the way in which we approach knowledge, and our trust or distrust of systems, and popular media and spy fantasies, all of these things that play into where we place our trust and where we acquire information from. Thanks for listening to What a Load of Coloni. See you at the next series podcast episode. Mauri ora.